Good evening, everyone. You are very welcome to the CPSMA Legal Matters webinar Board in Action. Later on this evening, the panel will invite any questions you may have. Please, when requested to do so, use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your PC or laptop screen. If you are using an iPad, you will find this feature located at the top of your screen. Without further ado, I will now hand you over to your hosts, Fergal Kelly and Deirdre Keane. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and my name is Fergal Kelly. We really appreciate you joining us here on this lovely sunny evening. We don't get too many of them, so we really appreciate your presence here this evening. So I'm an advisor with CPSMA, and I'm joined here by my colleague Deirdre Keane for tonight's webinar on the Board in Action. Now, while most of us are generally pretty familiar with the operations of a board of management, I suppose there are some things that crop up in this area that often aren't quite so clear-cut. So it was for this reason that we thought it might be helpful if we dealt with the topic of the operation of the board of management and how it works. And I suppose it is based on the queries that come to us in the office. So we hope that by the end of the webinar, you will find answers to questions that you may have had or have on the operation of a board of management. And hopefully there will be some helpful pointers for you on getting the most out of your board meetings in the future. We expect we're going to be about 45 minutes in duration tonight. So if you think the webinar has been helpful, you might consider using it as a resource for your board of management. If not, everyone could attend this evening. Or you might even consider playing it at your board, part of it even at a subsequent board meeting. So I suppose it's one area that we thought was particularly relevant. And I suppose in your feedback, you can let us know of other topics that you would like to hear from us on. So first of all, to start things off, we'll have a poll. And so I suppose the first question in the poll is, how long do your board meetings usually last? And we see it up there. So please populate this with your answer. It's less than 30 minutes, 30 to 60 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes, and 90 minutes plus. So if you choose one of those, what you're most familiar with or what you think your board meetings usually last. In my own experience as chair of board and as principal, definitely, I suppose meetings can range depending on the urgency of the meeting or depending on the topics at hand. So we're just waiting on the answers there. So some interesting results there, Deirdre.
Yeah, but just to, I suppose, just let people know, like someone has sent a query in already, Fergal, and we will be dealing with them at a later stage, but just to know that we will be having a copy of this recording up on our website, so there's no problem. You can listen to us now, but you can listen to us as many times as you want. So in terms of the response, Fergal, yeah, so you can see there that most board members are saying that meetings last between 60 and 90 minutes. And that, I would say, from calls coming in seem to be about the optimum. If you can manage to have your board meeting within an hour, I think that's probably really the ideal. I think if the most important thing is that people know they're coming out, let's say it's for an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, they know the start time and they know the finish time. And then there won't be that dread, you know, or the tension if somebody kind of holds up the meeting or if an issue comes up. So if something does come up, it's very, very simple to just hold it over, maybe ask people if they can stay for a further 10 minutes or if it will be raised again at a further meeting. But I think it's really important for people that they have that consistency and that they know we're going here at 7, definitely going to be out here by 8:15. And that is, that's a definite.
Okay, so I suppose a key question that we have to ask ourselves tonight is, what are the responsibilities of the Board of Management as set out in the Education Act? So the board is responsible to the Department of Education for the provision of education to the pupils in the school and for complying with department circulars and legislation. An example of this would be admissions, for instance, which are governed by both circular and legislation. It's also the duty of the board to manage the school on behalf of the patron and for the benefit of the students and parents. So the board is responsible to its bishop for running the school as a Catholic school and for upholding its ethos. And we'll say a little bit more about that later on. Now, the board also supports the principal who runs the school on a day-to-day basis and reports to the board in this regard. So the board is an employer and is responsible for recruitment and staff matters, and is also responsible for school finance, school policies, school buildings, and the health and safety of all. So we can see there that the board has a lot of responsibility. And so the question arises, Deirdre, as to how and when the board gets to perform this collective responsibility.
Yeah, and I suppose you have laid out like quite substantial responsibilities there, but not for boards not to be overwhelmed either, because in essence, the collective, I suppose, the decisions or I suppose the discussions of a board should and do take place at the board meeting. And that's really where the work of the board as such is done. And it's for this reason that it's really important that board meetings are structured properly. So we have an obligation to the department, we have an obligation to the patron and obviously to the school to make the most out of these board meetings. But as well as this, schools are also charities under the Charities Act of 2009. And in accordance with their legislation, we also have a legal responsibility to ensure that boards are run as efficiently as possible. So there's quite a lot of pressure on a board to use their time well. And I suppose it's for this reason that we start off most board meetings with an agenda. Now, I know boards, for example, have been operating now for the last 2 years in and out of COVID and through incredible situations and kept schools going, I have to say. But at the same time, it's really important that there is an agenda. And most schools would probably have an agenda, like most boards probably would have an agenda to start with. And there's nothing particularly magic, as you can see from the screen there. An agenda is simply a list of the items that are going to be covered at a board meeting. That's all it is. But nonetheless, simply having it there, I think, keeps people on task and keeps everybody on, keeps us all on task, keeps me on task as I look and I realize I have to get on to the next item here, Fergal. But the question is, how is an agenda actually set up? And I think in the main, it is really the principal that is running the school, and the principal is the person that's going to be more or less probably do most of the talking at a board meeting, and they know what needs to be covered at the next meeting, and they would normally set the agenda, perhaps agreeing it with the chairperson in advance of a board meeting. This would be sent out to all the board members in advance by email. Now, obviously, there'd be nothing confidential in an agenda. So you see the one in front of us there, it's just a list of topics. And if something is going to be dealt with under correspondence, for example, it will be. But you don't actually have to say what correspondence is coming in or what particular issues you're going to deal with if they're confidential. So it will be sent out to people normally about 7 days in advance of a board meeting. Sometimes, however, a board might require a meeting a little bit quicker than that. For some reason, there might be an appointment of a staff member. And in those circumstances, it's okay to have a shorter meeting. Once it's, we would call that in the governance manual, an emergency board meeting. And the word sounds very dramatic, but actually it just means a meeting that is not held or is not planned in the usual way. So you might, for example, have 5 board meetings in the year, 1 per term, and then suddenly you need an extra meeting for something, or there's a deadline coming up. That's what's called, I suppose, like an emergency board meeting. But as I say, it could be simple one-issue meeting on something that needs to be discussed at a particular time. Now, I should mention, I just glossed over it there. I spoke about the governance manual, and that is, it's a book that all board members probably should have. It's updated with each board, and this year is the current, I suppose, governance manual is 2019 to 2023. And that basically sets out all the processes and procedures that are used by a board at its meetings and in the operation of the board. So that's I would call that your Bible. And I suppose what we're here tonight to discuss is the tips around those things. We would be talking about those procedures, but in the most, we're just really talking about the board meeting and how it actually operates tonight. So your agenda is sent out. I suppose the board members read it, and then suddenly something happens. A board member realizes that there's an item on the agenda there, and they actually are concerned about it. It could be an upcoming appointment to an SNA, and a board member suddenly remembers that their first cousin or sister or brother is going to be applying for that position. Then they don't know what to do. So this is something that actually comes up quite frequently in our calls, and it's called a conflict of interest. So it's really important, if something comes up on the agenda that you have an interest in, be it an appointment, or let's just say the school was going to buy a piece of equipment and you had a company that sold that type of equipment. All of those things are really helpful to a board, but it's really, really important that you mention up front that you have a concern here up to the chairperson. The chairperson then will ensure that you're not at the meeting for the part of the meeting that relates to the issue, I suppose, that under discussion. So it's not to say, for example, that if you are tendering for something like to the school and you're successful, you can't remain on the board. But you can, it's really, really important that you're not there for the discussion about what the school needs. And equally, if somebody is applying for a position, that you're not there finding out what the school needs, I suppose, by way of a caretaker. So there's where conflict of interest comes in. Fergal, I'm sure you have some examples of, because it comes up a lot on our calls, doesn't it?
Yeah, Deirdre, and you know, I think we had a recent call to our office where, say, the teacher nominee on the board was applying for the upcoming deputy principal position, or sometimes the principal position. And in this case, it will be important that the teacher is not present for any discussion around the recruitment process that is just going to take place. Now, another situation can arise, and this is all about where you might not be present at a board meeting, and it can arise where a principal retires or leaves the position. Circular 0044/2019 is clear that the principal does not have any part in the process of the selection of his or her own successor. So we are often asked in the office, can the outgoing principal be at the meeting to ratify the appointment of the new principal? And the answer is no in this instance, because it is part of the process. Of course, sometimes it's not always clear. Is there a conflict of interest? As a professional relationship, for instance, does not constitute a conflict of interest. So if you're not sure, please ring us in the office, and we would be very happy to assist with these queries. Like sometimes it can kind of come as a shock to someone that they might not be part of a meeting. Yeah. So sometimes that can be managed and will have to be managed sometimes by the chairperson, and perhaps maybe a chat before the meeting or something. So it's just something to bear in mind.
Also, Fergal, sometimes it comes up that a member of the board sees that there's a vacancy in the school, and it could be by way of, let's say, like an SNA or a caretaker, and there's nothing to say that they actually can't go for the job. They just can't be at the meeting where they discuss it. And if they're successful, then you can't remain on as a board member, because there's only 2 employees that are allowed on the board, and they are actually the principal and the teacher nominee. So if you're appointed, let's say, to the job of SNA, then that's fine. But you just can't remain on the board at the same time.
Okay, hopefully that provided clarity just on that whole area. I'm just going to go back to the agenda now, because just to go through it briefly. So generally the first item for Catholic schools would normally be an opening prayer or reflection. And it's a really good way to start a board meeting in a Catholic school. It reminds us of the ethos of the school, but more importantly, it helps us to understand the Christian values of inclusiveness, kindness, and respect, which are central to school life. And these should also be central in the way that the board does its business. And it should be present for all decisions of the board relating to children, staff, parents, or indeed any aspect of the school community. So I suppose it helps to remind us of why we are there, why we are meeting, and what we are hoping to achieve as a board. Now, in fact, while we don't have it on the agenda here, Ethos may have its own piece on the agenda, particularly where there may be upcoming sacramental events or occasions that are important to the Catholic school community or the school community in general. And decisions on how ethos is lived out in the school can also take place here. So the second item on the agenda then would normally be the minutes of the previous meeting. And these are read out at the meeting so that they can be agreed as being an accurate record of the previous meeting. If anyone has any comments on the minutes, then they can be discussed at this stage. The minutes should just reflect decisions taken by the board, and they shouldn't be a record of the long discussion. And this is a question often asked of us as advisors. I suppose I can think of an example where, say there was a long discussion perhaps on parking problems around the school, and the decision that was taken was to write to the county council. Well, then that decision really is what should be recorded in the minutes. You can record there was a discussion and the decision taken was as follows: to write to the county council or whatever. So that decision would be it would be recorded then by the recording secretary, who may be the principal or someone else appointed for that purpose. Decisions should normally be made by consensus, as in the agreement of everyone around the board at the table. But that mightn't be the case, and if needs be, a vote can be taken, and in that instance, the chairperson would have the casting vote. However, best practice would dictate that there would be a consensus, but that if there isn't one, then the matter perhaps could be discussed again at another meeting, having given people a chance to think about the matter further. In terms of housekeeping of board minutes, it's important to keep the board minutes in a secure place. Remember also that board minutes should be written knowing that if an individual is mentioned in the minutes, that person may be entitled to the section of the minutes that relates to them by way of data protection. So names should not be mentioned in minutes unless absolutely necessary. So Deirdre, what else comes up in this area for you?
Well, actually, one of the questions I think that we're often asked about is, I suppose, can minutes be emailed out to board members after a meeting? I mean, draft minutes. And our advice generally is no, because the potential is there for confidential information to be contained in the minutes. So it's much safer if you don't do that, because you're emailing them to people in their home place. And so I think it's a better idea if they're just read out at the next meeting. Sometimes at the next meeting, if the minutes are long for whatever reason, draft minutes can be provided to members. But if that does happen, then it's really important to make sure to take up those draft minutes at the end of the meeting. Number one, they're just draft. And secondly, they could just be left somewhere accidentally by somebody, a piece of paper falling out. And I suppose the politicians have fallen on less Fergal. So I think it's important to just make sure that you get back those minutes if you do actually have to pass them out. The other thing you mentioned there was about, I suppose, about data access. And again, we have a lot of calls on that. If a data access request is made in relation to minutes, you are entitled to ring your school insurers. Allianz are delighted to deal with these calls and will give you legal advice if needs be. So no school needs to be on their own, I suppose, in relation to this. And they will advise you on how to give the relevant extract of the minute to someone that's actually looking for it. I think that kind of covers it.
I think so, Deirdre. Now, the next item, it brings me to the next item on the agenda, which is correspondence. Now, correspondence, of course, contains many items, and not all correspondence is really suitable for board meetings. So in some situations, or in many situations, the principal can deal with the correspondence in their day-to-day running of the school. But I think it is helpful to consider some types of correspondence that you may or may not be familiar with, but could arise in your school. So it would be, we're going to just consider those different types of correspondence now. And we're going to ask you for your views, because we're going to operate this in poll form, really. So we're going to post you a series of questions and just get your views on whether these pieces of correspondence should be presented to the board and should be brought to the board, I suppose, initially, really. So if here is the question. So the school has received a letter from a solicitor saying that a pupil has been injured at school and they are asking for records of the incident. So should this be brought to the board? Yes or no? So once again, this constitutes a query that's often asked from us as advisors, a letter from a solicitor. And so we just want to get your views. Should this be brought to the board? And certainly would be interesting to see the results. And Deirdre, what do you think of the results?
Well, the results are a resounding yes, this type of letter should actually be brought to the board. And that's quite correct. It should be brought to the board. However, the important thing to remember here is that this has come in the form, I suppose, of a letter from a solicitor. So it should not be responded to by the board. So yes, the board can hear that a solicitor is writing in, is looking for records, but the most important thing then for the board to do is to contact its insurance. This is what a school pays its insurance company for. This is what your insurance is for. And I suppose, Allianz or the insurance company are there, and it's their job to look after a letter like this or a claim like this in any event. So by all means, advise the board that this letter has come in, but then do not attempt to respond to it, or in fact, any letter from a solicitor.
Thanks, Deirdre. So the next letter now up on screen. The school has received a letter from an ancillary staff employee looking for an increase in pay. So should this be brought to the board? Yes or no? And I think where we've seen some movement with caretakers and secretaries and some changes coming down the tracks on that, of course, and with negotiations going on at the moment, we have seen this type of question come into the office, and we're going to get the results now. So Deirdre?
And again, I can see a resounding amount of people have said, yes, that this should come to the board. And absolutely, this is completely board business. Now, obviously, the important thing here is that, that the board has a look at the finances to check if it's in a position to pay an increase. And secondly, would have a look at the knock-on effect of paying one member of staff, because it could be the start of claims by other members of staff, I suppose, and not that they're not absolutely totally deserved. But I think it is important that they are brought to the board. However, at a later stage, I suppose we'll talk about writing up board minutes. And again, you know, that we could just take care, maybe not to mention people by name, and just say that the caretaker or a claim has come in for something, and just a little bit of care around that.
Okay, so we're just going to increase the complexity a little bit for our third question. And this one is where the school has received an anonymous letter claiming that a board member has committed a crime some years ago. And this person is requesting that person's removal from the board. So should this anonymous letter be brought to the board? Yes or no? So that's an interesting one. I wouldn't say it's a common query, but
we have had a few of them, Fergal. We've had quite a few.
It has come in from time to time. So the anonymous letter situation is a little bit complex. So let's see what the results are on that. Deirdre?
Okay, so there's a little bit more ambivalence here, but again, most people are saying no, that it shouldn't be brought to the board, and that's our view as well. We would say a letter should be signed, you know, before it's brought to the board. And I mean, you might get, for example, if there's a situation in the school where there might be a group of concerned parents and they would send in a letter unsigned, and that should not go to the board. In fact, any of these letters should be just dealt with in accordance with the procedures, but it definitely shouldn't go to the board. And if somebody knows who's behind the letters, the appropriate advice for them is to take it back to the school. So it certainly shouldn't come to the board. Now, obviously, if an anonymous letter comes in and it makes an allegation about child protection, a child protection matter, or maybe like a bullying matter, they would be dealt with by the school, by the principal or the chairperson in accordance with the appropriate procedures. And again, they would still not come before the board, Fergal. So the correct view taken by most people there.
Okay, very interesting. And so our last piece of correspondence this evening, the school has received a letter from a parent. It's a parental complaint. So should this letter be brought to the board? And sometimes there is that temptation to bring the letter to the board. And in this instance, we want you to say yes or no once again. And we will see the results now in a moment. So Deirdre, if you comment on that, thank you.
I think you were giving everyone a bit of a hint there, Fergal, because you were saying
was.
there's a temptation to say no. But anyway, quite correctly, everybody has said no. And this is one actually that's not always fully understood. And I think you might talk about it again like a little bit further. But in general, it is really important that if either parents or staff have a complaint, that again, it is dealt with in accordance with the procedures. And that means that it starts at the beginning, which could be with the teacher, speaking to a teacher, speaking to a principal, speaking to the chairperson. Now, eventually, if a matter isn't resolved, it may well come before a board. But it's really important that just because someone writes to the board, that it doesn't shoot right in and be considered by the board. And there's a number of reasons for this, but the most important being that I suppose it hasn't had a chance to get resolved at an earlier stage. But even more importantly, when it does come before the board eventually, the board is meant to be looking at it in an unbiased way. And if it has heard about it at every stage along the way, well, then it's really not in a position to kind of step back from the situation and give a board view of it. So really important, very, very difficult though, often I think. And sometimes, for example, every board member can actually get a letter. And again, we've had a lot of calls there where there's been a call maybe for an emergency board meeting, which I referred to earlier. They've all got a letter, and it can be very, very stressful on board members. But it's really important that those letters are given back to the chairperson, and that the chairperson orientates the writer of those letters towards the correct procedure. And you've probably come up with that, Fergal, as well, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you can react to these situations, and perhaps, as I said, the temptation might be to call a board meeting and sort things out straight away. But as Deirdre said, I think certainly, I think she has explained it very succinctly there, that there is a procedure and it should be followed.
I think also, I don't know if I'm going to mention this, Fergal, but there can be a feeling of pressure on board members. If you know that they, you know, let's say if they've been elected by parents or they've been elected by teachers, and that they have a duty to represent these people at the board meeting, and you know, and so other people put pressure on them. And I think, in fairness to the board members, it's the outsiders that don't really understand the role of the board members properly.
Yeah, I think maybe some members, as you say, of the school community might not fully understand the role of board members. And they think that you're a parent on the board, you should be able to bring this directly to the board. And of course, this is not the case, because, as we've said already, they have to go through the procedures. But in fairness, those who might approach the parents or other nominees on the board of management might not be fully versed in the procedures of governance or of a board of management. So that can put pressure on. So if you are approached in this way, I suppose it's important to have something maybe prepared and to refer people back to the school principal or the chairperson, who'll then deal with it in line with the next stage of the procedure. You shouldn't feel under pressure from those who elected you to bring matters up at the board level directly, but I suppose that doesn't stop it happening from time to time, but just to know what to do. Now, this brings me to the next item on the agenda, which is the principal's report. So I'm just going to share a slide there again, and Yeah, so the principal's report is a report on the life of the school, including self-evaluation, school events, possible innovations that are happening in the school, communication with parents, curricular developments, enrollment, the school calendar, policy issues, matters or actions that the board needs to know about. And I'm thinking at this time of the year, for instance, school tours are being planned. So perhaps the board, and certainly the board, would need details on these in terms of insurance purposes and everything else. Just topically, I suppose this might be the best time to discuss special education allocations, because schools have had to cluster with other schools to form posts, and the principal's report, I think, would be an appropriate space to discuss the changes or the clusters, the changes to allocations, and whether new teaching posts have been created as a result. Now, as a principal, I always liked at this stage to inform the board of school successes or achievements, or any new programs or new reading programs or anything like that, or curricular programs that the children and the classes were involved in. Sometimes a principal's report could include a report on admissions for the incoming year, and the current enrolment figure could also be included, just to give the board that up-to-date information. So the area has a really wide brief, really. It is a report on the goings-on in the school and what's topical and what's important. The principal's report must contain a report on bullying in the school at least once every school term, and Circular 0045/2013 deals with these procedures. Now, the Child Protection Oversight Report is really important, and it's often regarded as part of the principal's report. Deirdre?
Yeah, well, I mean, that report, as you say, is often part of the principal's report, and that has to be presented at each face-to-face board meeting. If you do have a remote board meeting, you are advised by the Department of Education not to have a child protection oversight report unless you're saying that there are no cases to report. But essentially for board members, well, I suppose, first of all, I should say that CPSMA actually has a webinar on the Child Protection Oversight Report, a special one. It's just a short one, which might be helpful for for board members who are struggling in this area. But in essence, the importance of the role here is just to check that the board, that the school is in fact complying with procedures. So either the school, if it has received a child protection report, has referred this matter to TUSLA, or it has sought the advice of TUSLA and followed that advice. And it's really important that the board members are just comfortable that either one of those two things are happening. And as I say, it can only happen at a face-to-face meeting. But also, you have to have a child protection oversight report at least once every term.
Okay, so I'm moving on to financial report, and this is given by the Treasurer, and it must be presented at every board meeting. It should indicate significant spends in the school, or any proposed spending on a particular item or requirement. It should give balances of accounts, and if possible, perhaps what could be included is an update in relation to departmental grants. If a grant has suddenly come in, I think this would be the appropriate place to include it. Once again, it's the piece where the board are informed about the school's financial situation. It might be that's maybe the time where fundraising projects are discussed as well, or any income due in this period, or any payments that will fall due before the next meeting. And the FSSU have really good reporting templates that are easy to use. Sometimes we get queries on reporting schools' financial records to the school community. And once again, there's a template available from FSSU that schools can avail of. And this gives a summary of the information that parents are entitled to, but yet it protects the personal information of school employees. Another query we have that crops up from time to time is the use of credit cards. So it's important to note that schools shouldn't use debit cards for school expenditure. And with regard to credit cards, that clear and concise guidelines are required to be put in place for the credit cards. It's really important to have protocols around their usage. And permission must be sought from the patron before a card can be applied for from the bank. And the FSSU have guidance on the use of credit cards, which would be very useful to you if you're considering this. Now, before we move on to the next topic, we have a further poll for you. We're just going to speak a little bit about policies here. So we're just going to post a question, and here it is. How many policies do you think your school has? And we gave you, is it less than 10, 10 to 20, or more than 20 policies? So it'd be just interesting to get your view. There's some, often we get queries to the office about what policies you should have and so on. So it's interesting to see what your views are on that. So if you choose there, the results are in. Yeah, and we can see there that it's very mixed. Certainly you can see that less than 10 policies, very few schools have a very small number of policies. And I suppose with increased compliance and everything else, that's very understandable. It's schools, it's evenly split pretty much there between 10 and 20 or more than 20. I suppose our view is that there's a tendency for schools to have policies on everything, but there might not be a need for so many policies. Obviously, there are the core policies such as admissions, code of behavior, anti-bullying, child protection, substance use, health of safety, protected disclosures, and so on. They're the policies that you must have. There is a checklist for schools available on the school self-evaluation website, which may be helpful in this regard. One thing about the school policies is it would be helpful, and I think for a greater efficiency of time and the use of the board's time, is if the policies or documents are sent out to the board members in advance so that the time can be spent discussing the document rather than reading it. So I think that's important. And then the last item on the agenda is the agreed report to staff and parents.
Yeah, so I mean, again, we've had the board meeting and all the decisions have been taken, and no doubt some things are going to be minuted. But how are the school community going to actually know what was decided by the board of their school? And that's really what this is about. So most principals in practice probably advise their staff on the ground, either in writing or a quick meeting, or just update them on a need to know both basis as they go along. But it is important, I think, to have some kind of a written communication with the school community, be it staff or parents, in relation to the main items that were discussed at a board meeting. Now, this is like nothing confidential or no problematic matters, but generally, maybe perhaps some of the things that are included in the principal's report that you were speaking about there, Fergal, things about the life of the school. So it's a perfect opportunity, maybe on a termly basis, just to communicate with the school community in relation to things that are up and coming and going on in the school, and maybe any decisions that are taking place about buildings or the use of the school or something like that, that would be of interest, I suppose, to parents. Now, I brushed over there, but that's not to say that it's not important not to include anything of a confidential nature. And as we all know as board members, confidentiality is absolutely key. The board would come to a halt and the school would not function if confidentiality was not honoured. And in fact, we recommend to boards that attention is drawn to everybody, to us all, at every meeting, just of the importance of confidentiality. It cannot be overestimated, I think. So it's really important not to speak about what happens at the board outside of the board.
Okay, and Deirdre, you're going to stay in the hot seat there because we have asked our attendees to populate the chat function and post whatever questions have arisen for them in the course of their work or during tonight's webinar. So send those questions in now. Deirdre is going to do her best to answer as many questions as possible and over the next few minutes. So I think some of the questions that have come in are really interesting, and they also reflect some of the questions that we have that have come into the office over the past while as well. So Deirdre, you ready?
I might just pass them back to you, Fergal, but anyway, or maybe phone a friend, but we'll keep going. I'll try.
Well, Jeremy isn't here anyway, so it's just me. But I suppose the first question that comes in, Deirdre, is if the chairperson is unavailable for a meeting, what happens?
Yeah, well, like there's certainly no problem with the existing members of the board, I suppose, deciding that someone else can act as chairperson of the board in a temporary capacity if the chairperson is unable to be there for a particular reason and the meeting has to go ahead. Now, obviously, if it's more than one particular meeting and perhaps like a chairperson is ill, then I think the patron would have to be contacted and an alternative chairperson, I suppose, to put in on a temporary basis.
Okay, we've another one here where the teacher representative was on maternity leave. Can they slot back on the board when their maternity leave is over?
This is one of the questions I think boards wish they didn't ask. But anyway, we'll answer it. Strictly speaking, in the governance manual, once you're going to be absent for, I think, 24 or more weeks, you're off the board. So sadly speaking, once you leave, let's say to go on your maternity leave, you're not a member of the board anymore. So the next person that's elected comes on and they remain on then until the remainder of that board period.
Okay. Now, we have a parent of a child in 6th class this year. The board are agreed that they can stay on the board. The parent is agreeable to stay on. And
no, so Fergal, no.
Okay.
I'll stop you there. No is the answer. I mean, there's only one exception. That is if the board is coming to an end of its term as a board, which will happen next summer. But other than that, no, you absolutely, if you don't have a child in the school, then you can't be on the board.
Yeah, this person is writing in and saying that often they get it hard to get 5 or 6 members at a board meeting. What's the significance of that? Well,
5 is a quorum. I suppose we should have mentioned it earlier. You have to have 5 board meetings, and 5 is the magic number here, I think, Fergal. You have to have 5 board meetings in every year, and you have to have 5 people at a board meeting. That, I suppose, where there's more than one teacher. More than a one teacher school. So you have to have 5 in order to be quorate, I think is the word that's used. You have to have 5 people at all times.
Okay. Now, here's one where this board found it difficult to get a father. So they've asked, can 2 mothers go on the board instead?
Yeah, well, certainly that's not provided for Fergal. I suppose, like, in the governance manual, and certainly currently anyway, you have to have a father and a mother. And I mean, that situation is actually is a problem right across the country. Like, we often hear about this, but unfortunately it has to be like a father's perspective and a mother's perspective. That's the reasoning for it. I think it's just to have the different perspectives on the board. That's why they have it set up that way.
Okay, so when interviewing for a new principal, is it normal for the chairperson to be the chair of the interview board, or would it be one of the independent board members?
No, it would be normal for the chairperson to be the chairperson of the interview board.
Okay. Now, in terms of, I'm just scrolling through here.
Yeah.
Should the financial reports be kept with the minutes of every meeting?
That's an interesting one. I don't have a view on that, Fergal. What do you think?
Yeah, I think in practice, they would have always been part of the file of that meeting. So that would be fine. Another question here is, how long should a principal's report be? And I'll take this one there, if that's okay. I suppose the principal's report can manifest itself. It can be a written report shared with the Board of Management, say, a few days in advance before the meeting. And often, I know just from my own practice, it often reflected probably the school newsletter that went to parents in a way. There were quite similar documents. But also it could be a situation where it's delivered orally. But it really depends on the events of the school. There will be some principals reports that are quite short depending on what's happening in the school. So I think that's...
There's no standard length then, Fergal.
No.
Really,
Do boards have to ratify curriculum policies? That's an interesting one. I would say yes. You know,
I think they have to ratify all policies, don't they?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think that curriculum are any different, you know.
Okay. So written requests for leave. So are they decided upon at a board meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I suppose then, just scrolling through the questions here, there's some really interesting questions coming in. Should I have a policy to review at every board meeting?
No, but you don't have to have a policy to review. I mean, I think principals often try and, I suppose, to divide up the amount of policies that they have to review over the number of board meetings they're having, so that they don't overburden the board or themselves at any one particular meeting. But there's no requirement to review a policy at every meeting.
Here's one that we kind of touched on, Deirdre, but perhaps we'll expand on it. Are board meetings, are the minutes of a Board of Management meeting bound by confidentiality, or can requests be made to view them?
Well, that's kind of like what we did touch on in terms of the data access. So they totally are confidential to the board. But if somebody is mentioned in the minute, then they may have an entitlement to see the extract that's specifically related to them. So you wouldn't be entitled to view the minutes of the meeting without your name being actually mentioned in that minute.
Okay, and here's one. One of our attendees has asked, why have we not got AOB on our agenda?
Well, that was really interesting. And it's very interesting because AOB is one of those items that may or may not be on an agenda. And I suppose we chose on this occasion to leave it out, probably like for time constraints. But in your own board meetings, you're entitled to have it on or not. Most schools, I mean, our advice probably is that there is no need, because there is an agenda and people have an opportunity to look for something to be put on the agenda if they'd like to. Actually, I think I might have forgotten to mention that if a board member wants to raise an issue, they can request the chairperson to put something on the agenda, and then it's up to the chairperson then to decide if it's a suitable item, I suppose, there for inclusion. The difficulty with AOB is that you've got your meeting organized, it's an hour or it's an hour and 5 minutes, and then something can come up at the last minute under AOB that kind of throws everybody, and nobody knows exactly how long it's going to take. But look, if something comes up that has to be discussed, well, by all means, then, as I mentioned earlier, like the chairperson can decide, look, we'll spend like another 5 minutes here, or we'll reschedule a meeting especially to talk about that item if needs be. So it's up to boards themselves.
Yeah, just interesting comment here. Deirdre, is I suppose it's contesting a little bit what we said about the minutes, where someone says that COVID saw the necessity to send out minutes by email. It's an efficient time saver for large schools where there are many topics to get through at a board meeting.
Yeah, and I mean, and I suppose the reasoning behind us is really like confidentiality and security. You know, I can't really put it any further than that. The difficulty is, like, in a work situation, people might be sending minutes of meetings like to each other in a work situation, but that's your work email and it's normally encrypted in a particular way. Home emails are a little bit different, and board members would normally be receiving emails at home. And often they could be shared access to computers. And it's just that danger around confidentiality. And I suppose that's why we advise otherwise. But I do understand what's been said.
Okay, I'm just going to take two more. I'd love to read these out. They are so interesting, and thank you so much for populating the chat box with your questions, because they really are interesting. And obviously we have elicited a lot of questions from you. So I would just take two more, I'm afraid. One person has asked about the obligations in terms of updating board members who haven't been at meetings? Is it okay to wait until the next meeting and the minutes are the record of that?
So if they haven't been at a meeting, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really important that there isn't a culture of having discussions between meetings. I mean, perhaps the chairperson might be a person who might be able to, is about the only person that could. But I think you're quite right, or the writer is quite right there. It should really take place at the meeting.
Okay.
Again, this is all bound up, I suppose, like in confidentiality again, isn't it?
And the last one is, what if you cannot get parent nominees? What happens?
Yeah, well, I mean, a board can be quorate without parent nominees. But we have known, like many schools, and they, you might start off not having them, then you might get one, and then after another while just get no. So I suppose our advice has always been just to keep trying, see what you can do. You can only do the best that you can do.
Okay, I'll have to call it there as time is moving on, and I just want to conclude this webinar just with, I suppose, a few housekeeping things and a few just pointers and suggestions and perhaps things we've touched on. We touched on the meetings, probably 60 to 75 meetings duration is best practice. If meetings go on too long, perhaps they're not then functioning as well as they should. The dates of the next meeting could be planned in advance, and that helps board members plan around their attendance. We said number of board meetings per year, 5 required, but could be more if necessary. 5 members are needed at a meeting as a quorum. You may have one issue or emergency meetings if necessary. And one of the most important things we said tonight is that you stick to the agenda. It gives structure. If something else is needed, if something happens outside of the agenda, it can perhaps be an item on the agenda for the next meeting. So I'd like to thank you all for your attendance at tonight's meeting. It has been lovely sharing our webinar and the information with you tonight. We have some resources there, as you can see on the slide. We have the CPSMA app. We're active on Twitter at Catholic Primary, and our website has a lot of information. It also has excellent newsletters and also some of the archive that are still very relevant. So please log on and you'll find lots of information there. We are here to help you, and our advisors are there at that number 016292462 to help you with your queries, and please don't hesitate to call. People call us, they say, oh, is this a silly question? It's never a silly question. All those questions keep your school running, and if we can help in any way, we will. So I want to finish by thanking you all for your willingness to volunteer and participate in boards of management. Over the years, I've had the pleasure to share on many boards, and I'm always struck by the willingness to help out at the school and support the staff. And so until the next time, good evening. We look forward to continuing to support schools in whatever way possible in CPSMA. Thank you.
And I suppose it's slán agus bannacht from me too.